Welcome to Mr. Nightmare Scares You. Whether you are a long-time subscriber who has been traversing the dark with us for years, or a new listener tuning in for the very first time, I urge you to turn off the lights, lock your doors, and prepare yourself. Tonight's video delves into a level of true horror that will stay with you long after the screen goes black. Before we begin the account, let's meet who lived this terrifying experience. David, 29 years old, from Columbus, Ohio, shared this story that will change the way you look at the night. Here is his account. I have always preferred the quiet isolation of the night shift. There is a certain peace that comes when the rest of the world is asleep, leaving you alone with your thoughts. I worked as a night watchman for a massive, privately owned storage warehouse on the industrial outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. The facility was an aging monolith of concrete and corrugated steel, spanning over 80,000 square feet. My job was simple: walk the aisles, ensure the perimeter was secure, and keep the building locked down until the morning crew arrived. It was late November, and the temperature outside had plummeted to a bitter 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Even inside, the heating system struggled to push the temperature past 45 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving a persistent, biting chill in the air. That particular night felt entirely different from the moment I locked the heavy steel doors from the inside. Normally, the vast emptiness of the warehouse was comforting, but tonight the space felt oppressive. The shadows stretching between the towering racks of inventory seemed darker, thicker, and almost alive. The overhead sodium lights flickered incessantly, casting a sickly yellow glow that barely penetrated the gloom at the far ends of the building. I began my initial patrol, walking down the central aisle, but I could not shake the overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. Every hair on my arm stood on end. It was a primal, deeply ingrained instinct, warning me of unseen danger, a feeling of absolute dread that coiled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to rationalize the fear, blaming it on the cold and the isolation, but the warehouse felt utterly suffocating, as if the air itself had grown heavy with malevolent anticipation. I reached Sector 4, which housed heavy machinery parts in the darkest corner of the building. As I turned down the aisle, a foul odor assaulted my senses. It was overwhelming, a sickening combination of rotting meat, copper, and the unmistakable musk of a filthy, wet animal. I covered my nose with the collar of my jacket, my eyes watering from the sheer potency of the stench. It was not the smell of a dead rat or a raccoon. It was massive and suffocating, clinging to the cold air like a physical presence. I swept my flashlight beam across the floor, expecting to find an animal carcass, but the concrete was clear. Slowly I aimed the beam upward. 30 feet above me, near the roofline, was a row of large industrial ventilation grates. My heart stopped. One of the heavy steel grates had been violently torn inward. The thick metal bars were bent and twisted as if they were made of cheap wire. Whatever had done that possessed an unimaginable level of physical strength. I stared at the ruined vent, the beam of my flashlight trembling. The terrible realization washed over me that whatever had torn through that steel was no longer outside in the freezing Ohio night. It was inside the building. The scent of decay grew stronger, and the absolute silence of the warehouse was suddenly the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. Panic is a cold, sharp thing when it truly takes hold. My immediate thought was to retreat to the main office and call the authorities, but I needed to confirm the perimeter. I moved backward, keeping my flashlight trained on the shadows, my breathing shallow and fast. I checked the rear emergency exits and the heavy loading dock doors. Every single one was firmly deadbolted from the inside, exactly as I had left them. There was no breach at ground level. This meant two horrifying things. First, the intruder had definitely entered through the roof vent 30 feet in the air, surviving a massive drop to the concrete floor below. Second, and far worse, I had completely locked myself inside with it. I was trapped in an 80,000 square foot steel cage. The walls, which were meant to keep thieves out, were now keeping me in. I tried to walk softly, my boots feeling unnaturally loud against the concrete floor. The cold air burned my lungs, and the foul stench seemed to be spreading through the aisles following the subtle drafts of the building. I gripped my heavy maglite tight, knowing full well it would be absolutely useless against anything capable of shredding industrial steel. I was entirely cut off from the outside world, a solitary target wandering through a maze of metal racks, waiting for the unseen predator to make its move. I navigated through Sector 7, moving toward the front office when I saw him. At the far end of an aisle, roughly 60 feet away, a massive silhouette blocked the dim yellow light. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood turning to ice. I raised my flashlight, and the beam illuminated a nightmare-made flesh. It was a dogman. He stood on two powerfully built digitigrade legs, towering at least 8 or 9 feet tall. His entire body was covered in thick, matted black fur that seemed to absorb the light. He was incredibly muscular, with broad shoulders and a chest that tapered down to a narrow waist. His arms were unnaturally long, ending in hands that possessed thick, curved claws, scraping against the sides of the metal racks. But it was his head that shattered my reality. He had the unmistakable head of a monstrous wolf, with a long, terrifying snout and ears pinned back in aggression. As the flashlight beam hit his face, his eyes reflected a brilliant, glowing amber. He did not flinch from the light. Instead, he simply stared at me, emanating an aura of pure masculine dominance and ancient malice. The sheer scale of him defied logic. My mind desperately tried to reject what I was seeing, but the foul stench and the sheer physical reality of the beast standing before me confirmed that the legends were absolutely, terrifyingly real. We stood in a frozen tableau, separated by 60 feet of concrete floor. He did not move, but his amber eyes bore into my very soul, analyzing me, measuring my fear. I could see the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his massive chest, his breath pluming in the freezing air of the warehouse. I knew instinctively that if I ran, his predatory drive would trigger, and he would cross the distance between us in seconds. I was completely paralyzed by a primal, crippling terror. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step forward. His footfalls were impossibly heavy, yet made almost no sound on the hard floor. He dropped his massive shoulders slightly, leaning forward into a hunting posture. A deep, guttural vibration began to emanate from his chest, a sound so low and powerful that I could feel it vibrating in the soles of my boots and rattling the metal shelves around us. He was not just an animal acting on instinct. There was a calculating, cruel intelligence in his amber eyes. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the doors were locked. He knew I had nowhere to go. He was savoring the hunt, and as he took another slow, deliberate step toward me, I realized that I was completely at his mercy in the dark. Are you ready for me to generate the second part, focusing on the contextualization and the rising tension of the hunt? The standoff felt like an eternity, though it was likely only a matter of seconds. Every instinct screamed at me to sprint, to turn my back and run as fast as my legs could carry me. But a deeper, more primal part of my brain knew that sudden movement would mean instant death. The dogman stood his ground, observing my every twitch with those burning amber eyes. I began to slide my right foot backward, scraping the thick rubber sole of my boot against the concrete floor, just a few inches at a time. I refused to break eye contact. The creature watched my slow retreat, his head tilting slightly to the side in a display of eerie, calculating curiosity. He did not lunge, nor did he immediately pursue. He simply stood there at the end of the aisle, a massive shadow blocking the pale yellow light of the overhead sodium lamps. As I managed to slip behind the edge of a towering steel storage rack, finally breaking line of sight, the sheer adrenaline hit my system like a physical blow. My lungs burned as I forced myself to breathe quietly. The layout of the warehouse was an absolute labyrinth, consisting of dozens of parallel aisles filled with heavy machinery parts, industrial equipment, and solid steel shelving units that reached 40 feet into the air. If I wanted to survive, I needed to navigate this maze and reach the main security office situated at the very front of the building. The warehouse spanned a distance of nearly 2 football fields in length, and the security office was at the complete opposite end from where I currently stood. To get there, I had to traverse a winding path through the heavy inventory, completely exposed in the dim, flickering light. The ambient temperature inside had seemingly plummeted even further, the air biting at my exposed face and hands. It had to be hovering near 38 degrees Fahrenheit, making the metal racks freezing to the touch as I guided myself along them. I kept my flashlight off, relying solely on the sparse overhead lighting to avoid giving away my exact position. Moving through the aisles, the sheer scale of the building felt less like a workplace and more like an industrial tomb. The heavy silence was oppressive, heavy with the foul, decaying scent of the beast that permeated the stagnant air. I measured my progress in feet and yards, stepping carefully to avoid knocking over any loose tools or debris left behind by the day shift. The entire space was a network of blind corners and deep shadows. Every time I reached the end of a row and prepared to cross the main central aisle, my heart hammered against my ribs. I knew he was out there in the dark, possessing senses far superior to mine, tracking me through the frigid air. About halfway to the office, the terrible silence was finally broken. It was not a vocalization, but rather the distinct heavy sound of metal yielding to immense physical force. 2 aisles over from my position, the heavy steel shelving groaned under an incredible weight. He was not trying to be stealthy anymore. I could hear the slow, methodical thud of his massive feet striking the concrete, vibrating through the soles of my boots. He was pacing me. The creature was intentionally walking parallel to my path, hidden behind tons of industrial equipment, letting me know that he was right there. I realized with absolute horror that he was herding me. He possessed a terrifying level of intelligence, purposely staying out of my direct sight, while using his sheer bulk and the sound of his movements to push me in a specific direction. The scent of wet fur and rotting copper grew incredibly intense, causing my stomach to churn violently. He was effortlessly keeping pace with my panicked, hurried walking, destroying anything in his path. I heard heavy wooden pallets splintering and solid steel brackets snapping, the sounds echoing through the vast space and amplifying my terror. He was demonstrating his power, a cruel psychological game designed to wear down my mind before he decided to close the distance. I pushed myself harder, abandoning stealth for speed as the front of the warehouse finally came into view. The security office was a small enclosed structure built directly into the front wall, constructed with reinforced cinder blocks and thick wire mesh glass windows. It was the only secure point in the entire 80,000 square foot facility. I crossed the final 50 yards in a desperate half-sprint, expecting to feel massive claws tear into my back at any given second. I reached the heavy, solid-core door of the office, my hands shaking violently as I fumbled with my keys. The metal keys clinked together in a chaotic rhythm, until I finally forced the correct one into the cylinder. I threw my weight against the door, shoving it open and hurling myself inside. I slammed the door shut behind me, immediately engaging the heavy steel deadbolt and sliding the secondary security chain into place. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the familiar sight of the security monitors, the small electric space heater, and the worn office chair offered a deceptive sense of safety. The temperature inside the small room was a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a stark contrast to the freezing warehouse floor. But as I backed away from the door and looked at the wire mesh window looking out into the dark facility, the illusion of safety shattered. I knew that a standard deadbolt and reinforced glass were meant to stop human intruders, not a 9-foot-tall apex predator capable of tearing through industrial roof grates. I killed the main light switch in the office, plunging the small room into darkness so I could see out into the warehouse without being illuminated myself. I stood perfectly still, watching the dim yellow expanse of the loading area just beyond the office window. The heavy, destructive sounds of his pacing had stopped the moment I locked the door. The entire building had returned to a suffocating, dead silence. The psychological toll of the waiting was agonizing. Minutes stretched into hours as I stared into the gloom, my eyes straining against the shadows, waiting for the inevitable assault on my fragile fortress. I gripped my heavy flashlight tight, my knuckles white, sweat stinging my eyes despite the comfortable temperature of the room. The absolute stillness was a weapon he was using against me. Then a massive shadow detached itself from the darkness near the edge of the central aisle, roughly 20 feet from my window. The dogman stepped into the pale sodium light, revealing his full, horrifying stature. He did not charge the office. He simply stood there, his broad chest rising and falling slowly, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He slowly raised his terrifying wolf-like head, locking his glowing amber eyes directly onto mine through the thick glass. He knew exactly where I was, and he was letting me know that a locked door changed absolutely nothing about my fate. I stood entirely paralyzed behind the wire mesh glass, watching the massive beast looming in the pale light. The creature slowly raised one of his incredibly long arms, pressing it against the window. The hand was a complete nightmare of anatomy. Heavily muscled and covered in thick matted black fur, it ended in curved, razor-sharp claws that had to be at least 4 or 5 inches long. He placed his massive palm flat against the cold pane of glass, entirely dwarfing my own hand. The sheer size of him was difficult for my brain to process. He leaned his monstrous wolf-like snout close to the window, his hot breath instantly fogging the glass. I could clearly see the thick saliva dripping from his formidable jaws, exposing rows of teeth designed exclusively for tearing flesh and crushing bone. He was deliberately testing the strength of the barrier between us. The physical pressure he applied was immense. I watched in absolute horror as the thick, reinforced glass bowed slightly inward under his incredible weight. The heavy steel door frame protested under the severe strain, emitting the harsh sound of bending metal. He was not attempting to break the door down immediately. His actions were calculated and focused entirely on psychological torment. He wanted me to fully understand that my pathetic defenses were completely useless against his raw strength. The putrid stench of his wet fur and rotting meat seeped through the tiny structural gaps in the doorframe, invading the small office space and mixing with the dry heat of the electric space heater. The 70-degree Fahrenheit air in the room suddenly felt thick and suffocating, coating the back of my throat with the taste of decay. I backed away from the window, my legs trembling so violently that I had to grab the heavy edge of the metal desk to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. My survival instinct desperately tried to override the paralyzing fear gripping my chest. I blindly reached out for the heavy black landline phone resting on the edge of the security desk. Because this was a secure industrial facility, the office was equipped with direct hardlines to the local police department and the main corporate security hub located downtown, roughly 15 miles away. I snatched the receiver and pressed it forcefully against my ear, praying to hear the comforting sound of a dial tone. There was nothing. Just empty, heavy silence. I frantically pushed the receiver hook down repeatedly, my cold fingers slipping against the plastic, desperate to force a connection. The line was completely dead. The grim realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. The creature had forcefully breached the facility through the roof, the exact location where the main communication lines and heavy junction boxes were mounted. Whether it was an act of intentional, intelligent sabotage or simply the collateral damage from his violent entry, my only lifeline to the outside world was completely severed. My personal cell phone had been entirely useless all night. The corrugated steel exterior walls and the thick concrete foundation of the warehouse always blocked the cellular signal completely. I was entirely isolated. I slowly turned my head back toward the window. The dogman was still standing there, quietly observing my panicked actions. His glowing amber eyes seemed to radiate a cruel, mocking intelligence. He knew I was trapped and helpless. I was entirely alone inside an 80,000 square foot steel tomb, completely stripped of any method to call for rescue. The absolute silence of the dead telephone line felt far heavier than the crushing weight of the massive predator standing just a few feet away from my fragile sanctuary. Without warning, the creature removed his massive hand from the glass and turned his broad shoulders away from the office. His massive dark form melted seamlessly back into the deep shadows of the central aisle, disappearing from the pale sodium light. For a brief, deceptive fraction of a second, my exhausted mind tried to convince me that he had lost interest and walked away. That false hope was instantly and violently shattered. A heavy, destructive impact resonated from the far side of the loading dock area, echoing off the high ceiling. He was attacking the main industrial electrical panel that controlled the power for the entire warehouse floor. The violent sound of heavy metal tearing and thick plastic shattering filled the vast space. A single second later, the pale yellow sodium lights positioned across the entire ceiling flickered violently and died simultaneously. The massive warehouse plunged into absolute impenetrable darkness. Only the faint, blood-red glow of the emergency exit signs remained, casting long, sinister shadows across the freezing concrete floor. The small security office I occupied was wired to a separate, dedicated battery backup system, which kept my single overhead bulb burning brightly. This effectively turned my small room into a glowing, illuminated beacon in the very center of a pitch-black void. I was completely exposed, a perfect target on full display, while he was entirely concealed in the surrounding darkness. I immediately lunged for the wall switch and plunged the office into total darkness as well, but the psychological damage was already done. He had forcefully stripped away my only remaining advantage, visibility. The temperature in the air outside the office was rapidly dropping back toward the bitter 12-degree Fahrenheit mark, and the surrounding darkness felt incredibly heavy and absolute. I strained my ears in the darkness, desperately trying to locate his massive presence in the completely blind void. The warehouse floor was heavily packed with industrial steel shelving units, with the tallest racks reaching 40 feet straight up toward the ceiling. I began to hear the unmistakable, terrifying sound of immense weight shifting and thick metal straining under pressure. He was no longer walking on the concrete floor, he was climbing. The heavy steel racks, structurally designed to hold thousands of pounds of dense machinery parts, protested violently under his massive, concentrated bulk. I could mentally track his progress as he ascended, the harsh sound of metallic groaning moving higher and higher into the pitch-black air. He possessed a level of physical agility that completely defied his massive size and weight. My panicked mind raced, trying to understand his hunting strategy, and then the horrifying, absolute truth dawned on me. The security office was a simple, freestanding structure, built inside the massive warehouse, featuring a standard drop ceiling composed of flimsy acoustic tiles and a thin aluminum framing grid. It had no reinforced roof of its own. If he reached the very top of the adjacent storage racks, he could easily bridge the short gap and drop his entire weight directly onto the top of the office. The creature was utilizing the vertical space of the building, completely bypassing the heavy reinforced door and the thick wire mesh glass. The sounds of his climbing abruptly stopped, and the heavy silence that followed was entirely agonizing. I knew exactly where he was positioned. He was waiting high above me in the freezing dark, 30 feet in the air, looking down at the incredibly thin ceiling of my fragile shelter. I slowly backed myself into the deepest corner of the small office, keeping my eyes locked on the white acoustic ceiling tiles directly above my head. The small electric space heater continued to push warm air against my legs, but my entire body was shivering uncontrollably from the sheer terror. Fine dust and small particles of industrial debris began to fall from the edges of the ceiling grid, drifting down through the dark room. Then, the thin aluminum framing directly above the center of the room began to visually bow downward. The physical weight resting upon it was absolutely immense. I watched in absolute paralyzing terror as the distinct shape of a massive, heavy foot pressed deeply into the fragile material of the acoustic tile. The thin metal grid groaned loudly, quickly reaching its structural breaking point. He was deliberately testing the physical integrity of the roof, searching for the absolute weakest point to tear his way inside the room. I was entirely trapped in a tiny box measuring barely 10 feet by 12 feet. If he managed to collapse the ceiling grid, I would have zero room to maneuver or attempt any form of escape. The foul, decaying stench of his wet fur suddenly flooded the small room through the air conditioning vents, incredibly thick and heavily nauseating. The beast was positioned directly overhead, separated from my body by nothing more than an inch of highly compressed fiberglass and cheap aluminum. I gripped my heavy flashlight with both hands, fully knowing it was an entirely useless weapon against his mass. But I desperately needed something to hold on to. The terrifying reality washed over me. The psychological siege was completely over. He was no longer playing games. He was actively breaking in, and I had absolutely nowhere left to run. The acoustic tiles finally surrendered completely. The thin aluminum grid, entirely unsuited for bearing any real weight, tore apart under the impossible mass pressing down upon it. A massive section of the ceiling gave way all at once, bringing a heavy, suffocating shower of grey dust, broken metal support strips, and thick yellow fiberglass insulation down into the confined space of the office. Following the wave of debris was the nightmare himself. He dropped straight down into the exact center of the tiny room, his landing transferring an immense physical shockwave through the solid concrete floor that traveled straight up through the soles of my boots. The sheer force of his impact displaced the air violently, forcing the breath from my lungs in a sharp gasp. The small 10 by 12-foot room, previously a sanctuary, suddenly felt no larger than a sealed coffin. The dogman stood up, attempting to reach his full, terrifying height. Because the office ceiling was exactly 8 feet high, the 9-foot giant was forced to hunch his massive shoulders significantly and bend his thick, muscular neck downward just to fit inside the space. His physical presence consumed every single available inch of the room. The intense, unnatural heat radiating from his massive body instantly overpowered the small electric space heater, raising the temperature in the room drastically and bringing with it the most suffocating, concentrated stench of a rotting carcass I had ever experienced in my entire life. I remained pressed firmly into the deepest corner, gripping the heavy flashlight with hands that had gone completely numb from raw fear. He slowly turned his enormous head toward me, his amber eyes burning with a cruel, triumphant light in the dim glow of the single emergency bulb that swung back and forth from its wire. We were now locked together in a tiny reinforced box, and he had utterly dismantled my defenses. I could clearly see the individual coarse hairs of his thick black coat, completely matted with filth, dried mud, and what looked terrifyingly like old blood. The heavy muscles rolled visibly beneath his skin, with every slow, deliberate breath he took. His long, heavily articulated fingers flexed downward, the thick, keratinous claws gouging deep, permanent scratches straight through the commercial linoleum floor, pulling strips of the material away effortlessly. Every single predatory instinct within his massive frame was completely focused on the corner where I stood paralyzed. There was absolutely no escape route left. The door was securely locked from the inside, and his massive body entirely blocked any chance of reaching the handle or the locking mechanism. I was entirely at his mercy, forced to breathe in the exact same foul air, waiting for the final devastating strike to end the horrific ordeal. The silence inside the tiny room was absolute and suffocating, broken only by the heavy, wet sound of his deep respiration. His chest expanded massively with each intake of air, taking up even more of the extremely limited space and forcing me to press myself harder against the unyielding cinder block walls. I was forced to observe the terrifying details of his anatomy up dangerously close, details that my rational mind desperately wanted to reject. His snout was long, angular, and heavily scarred across the bridge, bearing the distinct, hairless marks of countless unknown battles in the deep woods. His dark lips curled back slowly in a silent display of aggression, revealing gums that were a sickly pale black, holding rows of teeth that were thick, jagged, and heavily stained a yellowish brown. Thick, viscous drool pooled at the corners of his mouth and fell from his jaw, burning into the floor tiles with an acidic sizzle. He did not immediately attack, which was somehow far worse than a sudden, violent strike. He was displaying an almost human level of sadistic, calculating patience. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us to less than 3 feet. The sheer immense size of his chest was exactly at my eye level. I was forced to tilt my head slightly upward, just to meet his glowing amber eyes. Those eyes were undoubtedly the most horrifying part of the entire encounter. They were not the blank, instinct-driven eyes of a wild animal searching for a simple meal. They held a deep, ancient, and deeply malevolent intelligence that processed my fear like a tangible substance. He understood exactly what I was feeling, and he was clearly enjoying it. He was actively feeding on the absolute terror radiating from my trembling body. I felt a single drop of cold sweat trace its way down my spine, chilling me despite the overwhelming heat of his proximity. My mind went entirely blank, stripped of any rational thought, complex emotion, or strategic planning. All that remained was the absolute, fundamental biological instinct to survive, but my body refused to obey any internal commands to move or fight back. The creature slowly raised his right arm. The limb was as thick as a grown man's thigh, heavily muscled and ending in a hand that could easily crush a human skull with minimal effort. He extended his heavy claws toward my face, the razor-sharp tips stopping just a few inches from my eyes. I could literally feel the cold, sharp air displacement as he moved his digits. He was entirely in control, orchestrating a terrifying psychological torture session before the inevitable physical violence began. He wanted me to know exactly what was about to happen and how helpless I truly was. The agonizing tension in the tiny room snapped violently and without any warning. His arm moved with a blinding speed that was physically impossible for a biological creature of his immense size and weight. I did not even have the time to blink or flinch away. His massive hand swatted the heavy metal flashlight directly out from my desperate grip. The heavy object was thrown across the room with devastating, concussive force, embedding itself deeply into the reinforced cinder block wall and instantly shattering into unrecognizable, jagged pieces of aluminum and glass. The sudden impact sent a painful, violent shockwave straight up my arm, dislocating my right shoulder instantly and tearing the surrounding ligaments. Before the blinding pain could even fully register in my panicked brain, he struck again. He purposely did not use his lethal claws. He simply used the flat, hardened palm of his enormous hand to strike the center of my chest. The blunt force blow possessed the raw kinetic energy of a speeding vehicle. I was thrown backward with brutal velocity, my spine colliding heavily against the solid masonry of the wall behind me. The breath was completely driven from my lungs in a violent rush, leaving me gasping silently for air like a fish out of water. I slid down the rough surface of the wall, collapsing into a miserable broken heap on the cold floor. My vision blurred violently, the edges of the small room swimming in absolute, dizzying darkness. The sharp pain in my chest was absolutely excruciating, strongly suggesting several severely fractured ribs that made every shallow breath a nightmare. Despite the agonizing physical trauma radiating through my body, I forced my heavy eyelids to remain open. He was standing directly over me now, looking down at my broken, pathetic form. He had not used even a small fraction of his true, terrifying strength. The strike was merely a physical warning, a brutal demonstration designed specifically to emphasize his complete and total dominance over my life. He stepped even closer, deliberately placing one massive, heavy foot directly on either side of my body, straddling me completely against the floor. I was securely pinned, staring straight up into the open maw of the nightmare. The suffocating heat of his body washed completely over my face, carrying the terrible, concentrated scent of old copper and rotting decay directly into my nostrils. I could do absolutely nothing but wait for his powerful, bone-crushing jaws to descend toward my throat. The sheer helplessness of the situation was utterly overwhelming. I was a grown man, but lying on that cold linoleum floor beneath the massive dark shadow of the dogman, I felt entirely insignificant and completely ready to die. He lowered his terrifying, heavily scarred wolf-like head directly toward my exposed face. I tightly squeezed my eyes shut, mentally bracing for the inevitable, agonizing end to my life. The terrible, humid heat of his breath washed directly over my skin, smelling like an open grave. I could physically feel the wet drops of foul saliva hitting my cheeks and forehead. The end of everything was merely seconds away. Then, a completely random, external event changed the entire trajectory of the terrifying night. Outside the massive warehouse, a sudden, powerful Ohio winter storm had descended upon the isolated industrial park with fierce intensity. The wind picked up drastically, howling violently around the vast, corrugated metal exterior of the building. Somewhere up on the expansive roof, directly above the heavy electrical panels he had destroyed earlier, a massive piece of unsecured industrial steel sheeting was violently caught by the gale-force winds. The heavy metal sheeting was aggressively ripped from its rusted moorings and began slamming repeatedly against the solid steel girders of the roof structure. The resulting noise was incredibly loud and chaotic, a harsh metallic screeching that echoed violently through the entire 80,000-square-foot facility like a warning siren. The sudden, intense auditory disturbance caught the highly strung creature completely off guard. His extremely sensitive ears, perfectly accustomed to the dead, heavy silence of the dark warehouse, twitched violently backward. He instantly jerked his massive head upward, his aggressive attention completely severed from my broken body on the floor. His intense predatory focus shifted entirely to the new, loud threat originating from the high roof above. He let out a low, aggressive, guttural rumble that vibrated powerfully through the concrete floor, visibly entirely annoyed by the sudden, deafening interruption. He took a heavy step backward, removing his immense oppressive weight from the immediate space around my body. He turned his broad, muscular back to me, staring intensely up at the gaping, ruined hole in the office ceiling, seemingly trying to visually locate the exact source of the chaotic noise. This was the opening I desperately needed. It was a mere fraction of a second, an impossible stroke of pure luck provided by the bitter winter weather. My primitive brain screamed at my broken body to move immediately. I forcefully ignored the excruciating, blinding pain radiating from my dislocated shoulder and severely fractured ribs. I knew with absolute certainty that if I hesitated for even a single breath, the beast would return his deadly attention to me, and my fate would be permanently sealed right there on the floor. Using my only functional arm, I desperately dragged my battered, aching body across the rough linoleum floor toward the exit. The resulting pain was entirely blinding, feeling exactly like a hot, jagged knife twisting violently in my chest with every slight movement I made. The dogman was still momentarily distracted by the violent, repetitive metallic noise loudly echoing from the high industrial roof. I miraculously reached the heavy steel door of the small office. I grabbed the heavy deadbolt mechanism with my good hand and threw it open aggressively, physically ripping the secondary security chain entirely from its metal track with a burst of desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength. I pulled the heavy door inward and threw my entire body out into the massive, freezing expanse of the pitch-black warehouse. The sudden temperature difference was incredibly shocking, the 12-degree Fahrenheit air hitting my sweating, terrified face like a solid wall of solid ice. I absolutely did not look back. I forced my weak, trembling legs underneath me and began to run for the front of the building. My panicked sprint was an awkward, agonizing stumble, my injured left arm hanging completely useless and heavy at my side. The warehouse was an absolute, terrifying void. Without my shattered flashlight, I was navigating purely by frantic memory and the faint, dull red glow of the emergency exit signs located hundreds of feet away in the distance. I intentionally chose the main central aisle, the widest available path, to avoid running blindly into the heavy steel storage racks in the dark. Only a few short seconds after I cleared the office door, I heard the undeniable, chilling sound of the massive beast realizing his trapped prey had fled the room. A monstrous roar of pure, unadulterated rage erupted from the confines of the security office. A terrible vocalization so incredibly loud and terrifying, it physically shook the heavy machinery parts resting on the nearby shelves. The hunt was no longer a slow psychological game of intimidation. I had directly insulted his absolute dominance by escaping his perfect trap. I pushed myself significantly harder, my heavy boots pounding against the freezing concrete, actively ignoring the agonizing burning sensation tearing through my lungs. I was running for my absolute life through the darkest corners of Ohio, aggressively pursued by a nightmare made flesh, and the heavy, terrifying sound of his massive footfalls was already beginning to loudly echo behind me, closing the distance with impossible speed. The sheer adrenaline masking my injuries began to falter as I pushed my broken body down the massive central aisle. The darkness of the warehouse was absolute, a heavy curtain that offered no comfort, only the terrifying vastness of the 80,000-square-foot facility. Every single step I took sent a jagged spike of excruciating agony radiating from my dislocated right shoulder straight across my fractured ribs. I was forced to clamp my jaw entirely shut to prevent myself from crying out in pain, knowing that any vocalization would only further pinpoint my exact location for the apex predator hunting me. Behind me, the heavy methodical impacts of his massive feet striking the solid concrete floor grew steadily louder, vibrating right through the thick rubber soles of my work boots. He was not sprinting. He was merely maintaining a relentless, terrifying pace, easily eating up the distance between us with his long, powerful strides. The ambient temperature had plummeted back down to the bitter 12-degree Fahrenheit mark, and every desperate breath I dragged into my damaged lungs felt like inhaling shattered glass. I kept my eyes completely locked on the glowing red emergency exit sign hovering in the distance, a tiny beacon of survival situated at the very rear of the massive structure. It felt like it was miles away, though in reality it was perhaps only a few hundred yards. I could physically feel the heavy displacement of air behind me as the dogman drew closer, the terrifying scent of rotting meat and wet fur pushing ahead of him like a suffocating wave. He was intentionally letting me run, feeding off the absolute panic that practically radiated from my sweating skin. The red glow of the emergency exit sign slowly illuminated the heavy steel door at the end of the aisle. It was a standard industrial fire exit, equipped with a thick metal crash bar. I knew that once I pushed that bar, a piercing security alarm would echo throughout the entire building. But stealth was entirely meaningless now. I threw my entire body weight forward, leading with my functional left shoulder, and collided heavily with the steel door. The impact sent a blinding flash of white-hot pain directly through my skull, but my absolute focus remained on the metal crash bar. I pressed down with all the remaining strength I possessed. The heavy latch mechanism, frozen stiff by the brutal Ohio winter and years of neglect, violently resisted my push. Absolute panic seized my throat. I stood there, frantically shoving against the unyielding metal, entirely trapped against the final barrier. The heavy footfalls behind me abruptly ceased. A terrifying, heavy silence fell over the immediate area, broken only by the sound of my own ragged, desperate breathing. I knew without turning around that he was standing directly behind me. The overwhelming, putrid heat of his breath washed over the back of my freezing neck, sending a violent shudder down my spine. With a final agonizing surge of pure survival instinct, I slammed my knee forcefully against the center of the door while simultaneously pressing the bar. The rusted internal mechanism finally gave way. The heavy steel door swung violently outward, and I tumbled forward out into the freezing, chaotic expanse of the winter night. The brutal winter storm hit me immediately, the freezing wind entirely snatching the breath from my damaged lungs. Snow was falling in heavy, blinding sheets, severely limiting my visibility to mere feet. I hit the snow-covered asphalt of the exterior parking lot hard, the sharp impact severely jarring my broken ribs. I did not possess a vehicle. My apartment was only 2 miles away, and I had walked to work that evening before the weather had turned severe. I desperately scrambled to my feet, slipping awkwardly on the icy surface, and began to run blindly toward the distant tree line that separated the industrial park from the main county highway. I expected to feel the massive, tearing claws of the beast rip into my back at any given second. I expected the heavy weight of the 9-foot predator to crush me entirely into the frozen asphalt. But the attack never came. After struggling through the deep snow for nearly 100 yards, I forced myself to look back over my injured shoulder. The massive steel emergency door remained wide open, the dim red light from inside casting a faint glow onto the loading dock. Standing perfectly still directly inside the threshold was the massive, terrifying silhouette of the dogman. He did not step out into the storm. He simply stood there, a towering monument of dark muscle and ancient malice, his glowing amber eyes piercing through the heavy snowfall to watch my pathetic, agonizing retreat. He had successfully driven me out of his newly claimed territory, and he was completely satisfied with the psychological destruction he had inflicted. I do not fully remember the agonizing, freezing trek to the main highway. My mind actively blocked out the sheer trauma of dragging my broken body through the heavy snowdrifts. I eventually collapsed just inside the brightly lit entrance of an all-night gas station situated about a mile down the road. The terrified overnight attendant immediately locked the glass doors and contacted the local authorities. When the county sheriffs and the paramedics finally arrived, I was in a state of severe hypothermia and clinical shock. I tried desperately to explain the massive creature, the horrifying breach of the warehouse roof, and the absolute destruction of the security office. The officers simply nodded, their expressions filled with a mixture of profound pity and deep skepticism. They dispatched a heavily armed unit to secure the massive storage facility. Hours later, while I was receiving emergency treatment in the local hospital for a dislocated shoulder, 3 fractured ribs, and severe frostbite, the lead investigator visited my room. He calmly explained that the warehouse was indeed heavily damaged. The heavy steel roof grate had been violently torn away, and the security office was completely destroyed, precisely as I had described. However, they found absolutely no physical trace of any intruder. The investigator officially documented the incident as a severe structural collapse caused by the heavy winter storm, suggesting that the sheer trauma of the event had caused me to hallucinate a wild animal attack in the darkness. They entirely dismissed the massive clawed footprints gouged deeply into the commercial linoleum floor, attributing them to the movement of heavy machinery parts. The truth was entirely swept under the rug. Physical injuries eventually heal. My shoulder was relocated, and my ribs slowly knitted back together over the following months, but the deep psychological scars left by that night in Ohio are entirely permanent. I immediately quit my job as a night watchman and relocated entirely out of the state, but the suffocating terror absolutely refuses to leave my mind. Every single time the sun sets and the shadows begin to lengthen, the overwhelming fear returns. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, analyzing every dark corner, and checking the heavy deadbolts on my doors multiple times a night. I know the absolute truth. I know that the terrifying legends spoken of in hushed whispers are not just internet fiction or simple campfire stories. The Dogman is entirely real. He is a massive, highly intelligent, apex predator that actively stalks the deep, isolated woods and abandoned spaces of this country. I survived only because he simply chose to let me live, leaving me behind as a broken messenger. If you ever find yourself alone in the quiet, isolated darkness, and you suddenly catch the foul, rotting scent of copper and wet fur, do not try to rationalize it. Run. If you survived this terrifying account to the very end, thank you for watching. The dark reality of these dogman encounters is something most people simply refuse to believe until they are staring directly into those glowing amber eyes. If this true horror story sent chills down your spine, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our real scary stories. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in the deep woods? Drop your own encounters with the unknown down in the comments section below. I read every single one of them. Share this video with a friend who loves true horror and help us spread the nightmare. Until next time, keep your doors locked, stay out of the deep woods, and remember, Mr. Nightmare scares you.